For decades, the world believed one woman destroyed the greatest band in history. Yoko Ono has been called everything from a homewrecker to the person who single-handedly broke up the Beatles. But what if almost everything you thought you knew about the breakup was wrong? What if the real story was far more complicated, more painful, and more human than anyone imagined? In rare, candid interviews, Paul McCartney finally opened up about what really happened between him, John Lennon, and Yoko Ono during those final chaotic days of the Beatles. And what he revealed will completely change how you see one of music's greatest tragedies. To understand the truth about the Beatles' breakup, we need to go back to where it all began. On July 6, 1957, a teenage John Lennon was performing with his skiffle band at a church party in Liverpool when a kid named Paul McCartney showed up on his bicycle. That chance encounter created what would become one of the most legendary songwriting partnerships in music history. Together, John and Paul wrote 20 number-one hits, changed the face of popular music forever, and created a bond that seemed unbreakable. They were inseparable, constantly writing together, feeding off each other's creativity, pushing each other to be better. But by 1968, something had shifted. The magic was fading, and tension was building within the band that no one could have predicted. The seeds of destruction were planted long before Yoko Ono entered the picture. In August 1967, the Beatles' manager Brian Epstein died of an accidental overdose. Epstein had been the glue holding the band together, managing not just their business, but their interpersonal dynamics. With him gone, chaos followed immediately. The band was suddenly fighting over who should manage them. John, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr wanted Alan Klein, the manager of the Rolling Stones. Paul pushed hard for Lee and John Eastman, who happened to be his future in-laws. This disagreement became one of the biggest internal rifts in the band's history, driving a wedge between Paul and the others that would never fully heal. Then came Yoko. In November 1966, John Lennon attended an art exhibition at London's Indica Gallery, where he met avant-garde artist Yoko Ono. What most people don't know is that Yoko had actually tried to meet Paul McCartney the week before, asking him to donate an original song manuscript to John Cage's collection of modern music scores. Paul declined, but suggested she try John instead. It was advice that would change everything. When John walked into that gallery, Yoko immediately took his arm. They connected instantly, and when it was time for Lennon to leave, she forcefully demanded that he take her with him. By 1968, John and Yoko were inseparable, and she started appearing at Beatles recording sessions. This was absolutely unprecedented. Wives and girlfriends simply didn't sit in on studio sessions. They might pop into the control room for a quick visit, but actually sitting in the studio with the band while they worked, that was off limits. As Paul admitted years later in a brutally honest interview with Howard Stern, let's face it, we didn't welcome Yoko into the studio because we thought it was a guy thing. Wives and girlfriends weren't really welcome in the studio. It was like, no, excuse me, we're working. In Peter Jackson's documentary, The Beatles Get Back, you can see the tension firsthand. There's a moment where McCartney is caught on camera trying to rationalize the situation to others in the studio. He says, they're trying to be as near together as they can. They want to stay together, those two. So it's all right. Let the young lovers stay together. We got a lot out of the Beatles, so if it came to a push between Yoko and the Beatles, it's Yoko. Even as he's trying to be understanding, you can hear the resignation in his voice. He knew he'd already lost his best friend. The 1968 recording sessions for what would become known as the White Album were absolute torture. Each member worked in isolation, treating the others like session musicians rather than bandmates. The atmosphere got so toxic that Ringo actually quit the band for 2 weeks. Even their producer George Martin and engineer Jeff Emmerich found it unbearable, with Emmerich resigning during the sessions. Paul later described these sessions as a turning point, saying there was a lot of friction during that album and they were just about to break up. But what really hurt Paul wasn't just Yoko's presence in the studio, it was what happened after. In his podcast, About McCartney, A Life in Lyrics, Paul revealed something that clearly still stung decades later. He said that Yoko would tell John that Paul never did anything for the Beatles, that all he did was book the studio. Paul recalled John writing songs with comments about how the Beatles were rubbish, and Yoko feeding into this narrative. He asked, "Why would you say that?" You can hear the genuine confusion and hurt in his recounting of these moments. Then there was the infamous Get Back incident. During those final recording sessions in January 1969, when Paul was singing the chorus, "Get Back to Where You Once Belonged," John accused him of staring at Yoko and taking shots at her through the lyrics. When Howard Stern asked Paul if he had the guts to confront John about this, Paul admitted he didn't. He said it was kind of obvious, though. Stern pointed out that this passive-aggressive approach of just sniping at everyone wasn't healthy, and Paul seemed to agree. By September 1969, John Lennon had privately decided to leave the Beatles. In a meeting with the band, John came in and announced, "Hey guys, I'm leaving the group." As Paul explained in a 2018 interview with Howard Stern, John had found Yoko, and John loved strong women. His mother had been a strong woman, his aunt who raised him was a strong woman, and his first wife wasn't. So John had met Yoko and fallen completely under her spell. Even though the Beatles thought her presence was intrusive, John was done with the band. But it was Paul who actually pulled the trigger publicly. In April 1970, Paul refused to push back the release of his solo debut album to allow Let It Be to come out first. He announced the Beatles were over. Lennon was furious, saying, "I wanted to do it, and I should have done it. I was a fool not to do it, not to do what Paul did, which was use it to sell a record. I started the band, I disbanded it. The dream is over." Paul countered that the Beatles' breakup was because of straightforward jealousy, and that he wasn't to blame since Ringo left first, then George, then John. But the damage was done, and the blame game had begun. In December 1970, Paul took the devastating step of suing his bandmates, John, George, and Ringo, along with manager Alan Klein, to formally dissolve their partnership. As he reflected years later, it was one of the most difficult decisions he'd ever had to make. Could he really sue the Beatles? But he felt he had no choice. So what's the real truth about Yoko Ono and the Beatles' breakup? Paul himself has been consistent on this point. In a 2012 interview with David Frost, he said plainly, "She certainly didn't break the group up. The group was breaking up." The tensions had been building for years. Creative differences were tearing them apart. John wanted experimental, avant-garde sounds while Paul pushed for polished pop arrangements. George was frustrated that his songs weren't getting enough attention. Financial chaos reigned after Brian Epstein's death. The cracks were already there. Yoko didn't create them, she just walked into them. But here's what makes this story so painful. Even though Paul knew intellectually that Yoko wasn't solely responsible, emotionally, it was hard not to blame her. After John's tragic death in 1980, things got even worse between Paul and Yoko. She gave interviews that absolutely devastated Paul. Author Hunter Davies wrote that Paul called him months after John's death, furious about an interview where Yoko said that Paul had hurt John more than any other person. Paul told Davies these were some of the cruelest words he'd ever read. He couldn't understand how he could have hurt John more than anyone else, and he thought it was unfair that nobody talked about the times John hurt him. Paul recalled their competitive relationship, saying, "We were always in competition. I wrote Penny Lane, so he wrote Strawberry Fields. That was how it was, but that was in compositions." He was confused because the last time he'd spoken to Yoko before that interview, she'd told him that she and John had just been playing one of Paul's albums and had cried. So why was she now attacking him publicly? Despite the pain and the lawsuits and the decades of bad blood, something remarkable happened. Paul McCartney eventually found peace with Yoko Ono. By 2013, Paul told Rolling Stone that he'd come around in his thinking about her. He said, "I thought if John loved her, there's got to be something." He's not stupid. He realized he had a choice. Was he going to hold a grudge he never really had? George Harrison had given him great advice, telling him, "You don't want stuff like that hanging around in your life." Interestingly, there's even a story from March 1974 that shows just how complicated these relationships were. Paul actually helped John and Yoko reconcile during a separation. Yoko had visited Paul and his wife Linda in London, telling them she'd take John back if he worked for it. Paul then traveled to Los Angeles, where John was working with Harry Nilsson, and convinced him to repair things with Yoko. Paul asked John, "Do you still love her?" When John's guard came down and he admitted he did, but didn't know what to do, Paul told him that Yoko still loved him too, but he'd have to work hard to win her back. John did exactly that, and not long after, their son Sean was born. Today, at 83 years old, Paul McCartney continues to perform around the world, playing both Beatles and Wings songs to sold-out crowds. He's achieved everything a musician could dream of and more. Multiple Grammy Awards, a knighthood, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. But perhaps his greatest achievement is finding a way to make peace with the past, to forgive, and to focus on the music and the love, rather than the pain and the lawsuits. So what can we learn from this complicated, messy, beautiful story? First, that the truth is rarely as simple as the headlines make it seem. Yoko Ono didn't break up the Beatles. The Beatles broke up the Beatles. Creative differences, financial chaos, personal growth, changing priorities, all of these things contributed to the end of the band. Yoko was just an easy scapegoat for fans who wanted someone to blame. Second, that holding on to grudges only hurts ourselves. Paul could have spent the rest of his life bitter about Yoko, about John, about how things ended. Instead, he chose to remember the good times, to honor John's memory, and to forgive. As he said himself, if John loved her, there had to be something there. That's wisdom that took decades to achieve. Third, that even the closest friendships can fracture under pressure. John and Paul's bond seemed unbreakable, but fame, creative differences, and outside influences pulled them apart. It's a reminder that relationships require work, communication, and sometimes the courage to confront problems directly rather than passive-aggressively sniping at each other. The Beatles story is ultimately about four young guys from Liverpool who changed the world and then grew apart, because that's what people do. They outgrew each other, they wanted different things, and that's okay. What makes Paul McCartney's journey so inspiring is that he found a way to transform that pain into music, into forgiveness, into wisdom. He didn't let the bitterness define his legacy. Instead, he kept creating, kept performing, kept spreading joy through his art. So here's my question for you. Do you think Yoko Ono deserves the blame she's received for 5 decades? Or is it time we recognize that the Beatles' breakup was far more complicated than one woman showing up at recording sessions? And what do you think is Paul McCartney's greatest achievement? The music he created or the grace with which he's handled one of the most public breakups in history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of music's greatest stories, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content that goes beyond the headlines to find the real truth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.